Hey everybody, welcome back to La Enragé. I'm Patrick.
This is Taylor.
Excellent. This time we're going to talk about the dialectics of Dark Souls, do some theory talk, and Taylor's going to get us started on a new game.
Yeah, The Adventures of Hot Chomsky.
Hot Chomsky.
Is the music too loud?
I'll turn it down.
Okay. So we're gonna be, dude.
Alright.
We're gonna. Obviously, I gotta go deprived because I'm a wimp.
You're not going to start as a pyromancer for the hot part?
No, I'll just speed run to the Pyromancer guy's
Okay.
place.
Alright. That's fair. You're going to do the old witch's ring as well to talk to
I think so.
our spider waifu.
Of course, of course.
Yeah, as you do. Alright. So, Hot Chomsky. There we go.
Obviously, it's gotta be pretty built.
Well, yeah, of course. Just like
I
real
mean,
real Chomsky.
yeah, yeah. He works out like every other day.
Yeah,
You know.
yeah. It used to be every day, but now he's old, so
Yeah.
it's every other day
Yeah, 90 years old,
now.
only only do like 50 push-ups
Did you ever
every
see
day.
Did you ever see those videos of Ruth Bader Ginsburg exercising?
No, I did not.
They're amazing.
Yeah.
Because she was whatever age she was, and in
Hmm.
her late 80s or whatever, and
Uh-huh.
she had this personal trainer that was like a total bro, and she had the
Uh-huh.
little dumbbells that were probably like 3 or 5 pounds or something, and she'd pump them, and she'd do like sit ups and stuff. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's how she lived so long, I think.
Well, it makes sense.
Okay, so I am just gonna kind of get started on explaining
Hmm.
a little bit of dialectical materialism. This comes
Yeah.
from Marx and Engels, and disclaimer at the top here. Uh, I know, I know. So don't at me about not getting deep enough, or this part is the way I'm explaining it is not like because everybody has different feelings about theory and stuff. Obviously you can, but I mean for the audience, don't at me. Uh, that's the
Of course,
disclaimer at the
of course.
beginning.
I will be adding you every other sentence.
that's
So I mean,
that's great. That's fine because
yeah.
that's the dialectic right there. but uh, but yeah, I'm explaining it based on my understanding and a quick overview to then get into the Dark Souls part. Karl Marx, who wrote in the mid to late, or maybe really just around the mid 19th century, so the mid 1800s, based his concept of dialectical materialism on Hegelian dialectics. Hegel was a philosopher from before that. Do you remember when he was writing off the top of your head?
I don't. He was like 18th century,
Okay,
maybe mid to late. He was not too long before Marx. I think he died shortly before Marx got into writing.
okay, all right.
But
So, um, some of the concepts from Hegel that end up in Marxist theory are things like alienated labor, the lord and the bondsman,
mhm.
substance and subject, or the contradictions therein, and concepts of freedom. So I'm just going to kind of talk about each of those really briefly here. The idea of alienated labor is, as you know, Taylor, is the the idea that there once was a time when individuals enjoyed the fruits of their own labor for the most part. They working on a farm, or going out hunting, or whatnot. The majority
Kind
of
of communist hellhole is that?
yeah, exactly. Yeah. You know how feudalism was super communist. No, but they people would do things. If you had clothes, you'd make them yourself. You would hand them down. You would mend them. You would Most of what you produced in your workday was for you or your family or your kinship group. Some of it went,
Mhm.
in the feudal model. Some of it went to, landlords and such. But that was the idea. And so the idea of alienated labor is that as the world industrialized, more and more folks were doing work that they didn't immediately benefit from. They were paid wages instead of paid in the actual goods that they were producing. And so when you get a wage, you can then go buy other things that you didn't produce, that someone else produced. And so it changes the way that a person relates to the labor that they do, because no longer are they responsible for uh, everything that they have to do. So alienated labor is basically that you do not get a cut of the thing that you produce anymore. Instead, you're just given an abstracted wage that is worth some amount of other things. And you could use that wage to buy some of what you made down the
Mm-hmm.
production line, but you're buying it at the profit amount, not at the production amount.
Mm-hmm.
That's the concept of alienated labor.
Yeah, yeah, and there's also, there's I think you mostly touched on the exploitation aspect of it, where it's like surplus value is being extracted. There's also like control of the workplace and like
Right,
control over how you work, when you work, and that sort of thing.
right.
Is another role.
And I'm just, as it stands right now, I'm just talking about the Hegel part, and then
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
and then we'll kind of get into the Marxian part. But that's a good point. Is that there is an inherent exploitation that comes with alienated labor. The Lord and the Bondsman is going to be really, I think, integral to what I kind of want to talk about with Dark Souls today.
Mm-hmm.
And the
Mm-hmm.
idea of the Lord and the Bondsman is that there's the Lord, they're the aristocracy, or the noble or the landlord, and so they own the, I guess in Marxian terms, they own the means of production. They control things.
Mm-hmm.
They control the state or whatnot. The bondsmen are those who are bound to that lord. So those who live on the lord's land and work on it, or those who live in the or who work in the factory and work for a boss, things like that. And the idea that Hegel puts forward, that Marx later expands on, is that the lord living in luxury actually has diminishing consciousness over the generations, and the
Yeah,
bondsman
yeah.
gains consciousness higher than the lord, because the bondsman actually lives in a world that has stakes and difficulty and
Yeah.
toil.
The bondsman like interacts with reality,
Right.
whereas the Lord just interacts with reality through their relationship to the bondsman. You know?
Exactly, and doesn't have to produce their own wealth. Their wealth is produced by others, and it expands. Looking good, by the way. It expands on its own. And so that the idea of the Lord and the bondsman is that as time goes on, the Lord grows weaker, fatter, more avaristic, and the bondsman, in their continued exploitation, gains over time, over generations, gains a higher consciousness and a higher sense of community than their Lord. So that's important for this discussion. Um, Another important thing with Hegel, and the thing that makes it dialectic, is the idea.
Look at that chest hair.
That's when I think of Chomsky, this is what I think of. Yeah, when I
Yeah,
when I
me
think of
too.
Noam
Me too.
Chomsky, this is him right here.
Pretty much.
Yeah, yeah. He's got to have the beard though, right? Or
Yeah, that's a good point.
are there beards in this
Also,
game?
there's got it, right?
Are there? I actually I don't remember.
It might not be actually,
I think that
which
comes
is kind of like,
that comes in the later ones. This is the young Chomsky.
yeah.
This is
He
Chomsky.
still has silver hair. Don't worry.
He's always been Chomsky the Gray.
Yeah,
He's always
exactly.
been, later.
Don't look up actual pictures. They're fabricated by the CIA.
That's right.
It's not real.
That's right.
Yeah.
they've been lying to us about what Chomsky looks like the whole time.
He's also like absurdly tan because
Yes, yes, of
you
course,
know.
of course. Yeah.
Not sure it's gonna let me change his face color without changing his whole face. I think it already did it. God damn it.
Start over. Start over. You can do it again.
Anyway.
It gives me more time to explain dialectics. All right.
Yeah.
Substance and subject and the contradictions therein. Another Hegelian idea. Another one that's really important to the Dark Souls conversation. So, the idea of the dialectic is, put simply, thesis, the thing, plus antithesis, the opposite of the thing, equals synthesis, the reality of the thing. So everything is, be it a person.
This is still Hegelian, right?
Yes, yeah, exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
Everything, be it a person or an object or a social phenomenon or whatever, is both itself and the opposite of itself. In the same way
Mhm.
that, think of a silhouette, right? You see the black part
Mhm.
of the face, but you also see the white part around it. If it were all black, there'd be no silhouette. It would just be a black square or whatever. It
Mhm.
requires the contrast between the black of the image and the white of the surroundings, or vice versa, whatever, um, to understand what the image is. That is the thesis and antithesis creating the synthesis. That's just what I think of as the easiest way to get that concept.
Mhm. Mhm.
Contradictions, then, are not inherently, well, I mean, they are inherently negative, and negativity is a really important part of Hegelian
Yeah.
dialectics, but
Yeah.
that's not what I mean. Contradiction is often a negatively charged word, and in this case, contradiction just means the difference of the two things in that
Mhm.
silhouette kind of idea. And so that's going to be important in the conversation about Dark Souls as well. Do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think you've pretty much nailed it. I think the concept of like absolute negation in Hegelian dialectics is still somewhat confusing to me. I feel like I never quite got that.
Yeah, yeah.
But that's perhaps neither here nor there.
Yeah, I mean, the important thing is just understanding that this is difficult for us and our common sense to get our minds out of, because we're taught that
Yeah.
everything is itself
Uh-huh.
and not anything else,
Yeah.
and it takes a little bit of doing with the mind to think about the negative space around something that contextualizes it, because everything
Uh-huh.
exists
Uh-huh.
within context. Nothing exists within a vacuum. I think that's at least what I've gotten. I think that's
Yeah,
the most
yeah.
important thing.
And that plays into, well, actually I think you're about to get perhaps more into this, but that plays into like the master slave dialectic where before the master and slave encounter each other, they have like no concept of self, but it's through encountering each other that they recognize their own identity, right?
Right. Right. I wasn't going to bring that up, but that's excellent, and that's worth bringing up. That
Mm-hmm.
our identities are not, and this is a hot take. This is controversial, but our identities are not our own. Identities are ascribed to us. They are given to us
Yeah,
by others. So
yeah.
you don't get to choose necessarily that you're a black person. You don't get to choose
Mm-hmm.
necessarily that you're a woman or whatever. Um, but where that gets messy, and where I could be immediately accused of transphobia right there, is that you also, by growing up and existing in a socialized world, you end up adopting and understanding the identities that are ascribed. And there are
Mm-hmm.
times where, in the case of a trans person, the ascribed identity and the felt identity don't match up the way that
Yeah,
they are socially expected to.
yeah, yeah.
So that's important, and it's good that you bring that up. That we are in relation to others. We are not an
Mm-hmm.
island. We can't be an island because we're social creatures. So
Yeah.
so
I don't think that's I don't think that has any transphobic sentiments in it. I think that's just a recognition of reality that like society places certain expectations on people to fit into
right,
what's supposed to be, and that often contradicts what someone wants to be or expects themselves to be. You
right,
know?
excellent. Yeah, exactly. And what we want to be and expect ourselves to be is also based on that same socialization process. So
That's also true. Yeah, it's
so
very intertwined.
more often than not, our identities end up matching with the things that are ascribed to us because
Mhm.
we learn them and internalize them at subconsciously at such a young age that there's no choice involved. But
Mhm.
there can also be inconsistencies between the things that are ascribed to us and what we want, or what we feel. Want even makes it sound like it's a choice, whereas it's really not a choice. It's what you feel is how you feel. In the same way that you can want to like the taste of strawberries, but if you don't like it, you don't. You know what I mean? Like you can't force yourself to like things or
Yeah,
to feel a
yeah,
certain way. Um,
yeah.
the last bit on Hegel is the idea of freedom. And I think that this is an important one for the Dark Souls conversation, but also just in general because Marxists and leftists, communists like ourselves, get accused all the time of being like authoritarian and 1984, take
Yeah.
everyone's choice away, take all their freedom away. Which,
Wait, that's not what we're about.
oh yeah,
I was signing up for Inksto strike.
yeah, 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 yeah.
That's
News flash. Yeah, news flash.
we're actually pro 1984
Hmm.
on this chat.
Yeah, Big Brother is my friend. Um,
Uh-huh. Freedom of slavery, all that
yes, of course, of course. War is peace. We were never at war with Eurasia.
stuff.
All these. But
Yeah, Oceania,
yeah, yeah,
God bless.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah,
Uh,
yeah, yeah, yeah. What are you talking about? We've always been at war with Eurasia.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
so freedom is important in the Hegelian dialectic and the Marxist historical materialism that comes out of it, because freedom is essentially, they argue, the theme of human history. The reason that anything has changed over time is because different groups, typically subaltern groups, meaning those who do not have a political voice, or peasantry or lower status folks, doesn't have to be the lowest tier, but lower tiered folks, that it is through the exercise of freedom by those who are not allowed to exercise freedom that change comes about in history.
Mhm.
That is what toppled feudalism, mercantilism, uh, potentially capitalism. That's sort of the idea. And so then the last thing on dialectical materialism, then we can talk about Dark Souls, and this is what we get from Marx. This is the core idea of all of these things, the synthesis, if you will,
Mhm. If you will.
if you won't, uh, is that history is a series of class struggles, is the
Yeah.
core classic Marxist idea,
Hmm.
is that you can find any time in history, and there are at least two classes, possibly more, in conflict, and through that thesis antithesis combo, you get social change of some kind, and that's the synthesis. Um, Part of that idea is a Darwinian view of social change, which has been critiqued, and I would say, as a caveat, I'm not fully on board with it as evolutionary, because that sort of implies a one-directional. Uh,
Transition, almost like deterministic.
yeah, yeah, exactly. But of course, anyone who knows about Darwinian evolution knows that it isn't deterministic. It just means
Random.
yes, exactly. It's true pure random, which is to say, all the things from before. Well, I guess it's not pure random, but it is true. It is naturally random, which is to say, all the things that came before are influencing the thing that comes next. But the thing that comes next could be any combination of these factors.
Yeah,
So it's not
yeah.
fate necessarily. It's not deterministic. Um, and then also important to Marx is the idea of a cyclical nature of revolution. That
Hmm.
there will
Hmm.
there will
Yeah.
there will be a revolution, then there will be a time of stagnation, which will bubble with insurrection until eventually it hits another revolutionary point, because it
Sounds familiar.
exactly. So, because it can only stay for so long. It can only stay the same for so long. And essentially the momentum of the wheel is going back to the bottom, and it will be carried once more around, and it will be perpetual. That's the idea.
Mm-hmm.
Before I move
Yeah.
before I move on to Dark Souls,
Go ahead.
what do you think about all that?
Yeah, no, I think that part of what doesn't get emphasized as much in like Marxist thought is class struggle is a large component of that revolutionary cycle. But something that Marx mentions briefly in the manifesto, that this line that like almost never gets talked about, and I actually wrote an entire article about this for this school newspaper relatively recently. But
Nice.
like one of the lines is um, the class struggle that drives forward society um, always ends either in a revolutionary reconstitution of society, or in the common ruin of the contending classes.
Mm.
Um, and historically, that has played out. That's pretty evident. So like, not only is that helps complicate, I guess, the historical narrative of Marxism. So that's like when one of the problems when we try to you could say prove Marxism historically is that sometimes it's difficult to prove that this class specifically was opposed to this class or whatever.
Right.
But what that line helps pave the way for is the idea that it's not just revolutions by themselves that drive forward social progress, but it's also, you know, society isn't just reconstituted by revolution; it's also reconstituted by common ruin,
Yeah.
and that's you can see that example of social development almost even more common than revolution in like in the development of feudalism and even in capitalism. And the main two examples I point to is like the fall of the Roman Empire and the Black Plague, which both were like nearly apocalyptic and total destruction of society. Like the population of Rome after its fall fell like by over 90%.
Right.
Rome at its height was like 1 million people at the height of the empire, and then by like the whatever century and during the Middle Ages, it was like 20,000 people. So it's like virtually an apocalypse.
Yeah.
Um, and then the Black Plague killed like half the population of Europe or whatever. So in short, both of these situations set up essentially like the pathway for revolutionary activity to take place, and that helps explain historically the, I guess, relationship between class struggle and other social factors in developing new types of society.
Right. Yeah, I mean, what that makes...
That's the best. Go ahead. That's the best I could summarize it while also beating this.
Yes, of course, of course. You could put your club on, you know.
I don't know if I picked it up.
You did. Yeah.
I did.
Yeah. You were just talking about the Black Plague. But yeah, I mean, what it makes me think of is like as a writer or as a creative of any kind, right? Everything that you write or everything you create is not your magnum opus. You're gonna do that once in the case of a magnum opus, or you're gonna do a great piece occasionally, but you will write and then ball up and throw away more than you will write and keep, generally speaking, as a creative, I think. And that is sort of, if I'm understanding kind of what you mean, that's sort of the point where not every revolution goes through, as we know from history, and not everything ends up being monumental, but it is through the process of kind of fucking up revolutionary struggles over and over again that eventually we get to one where I say eventually a society gets to one where it actually does make some kind of change.
Yeah, and it's also, I guess the other point is like, to some degree, environmental, like outside factors have to make possible the revolutionary moment.
You're no hollow, Thank goodness. I'm done for, I'm afraid. I'll die soon, then lose my sanity. I wish to ask something of you. You and I were both undead. Hear me out, will you? Regrettably, I have failed in my mission, but perhaps you can keep the torch lit. There is an old saying in my family: thou who art undead art chosen. And thine exodus from the undead asylum maketh pilgrimage to the land of ancient lords. When thou ringest the bell of awakening, the fate of the undead thou shalt know. Well, now you know. And I can die with hope in my heart. Oh, one more thing. Here, take this. Now I must bid farewell. I would hate to harm you after death. So go now, and thank you.
I guess the main takeaway is that it's not always as cut and clean as like the traditional Marxist narrative of just class struggle.
Yeah.
Like, other things play roles within it as well, and we're not, I guess, class reductionist or something like that. But
yeah, it's worth it to point out that there, in all of these discussions of political philosophy and sociology, there is always so much more nuance than can possibly be said in the conversation. And I think a lot of bad faith or just kind of dumb actors use the fact that there's extra nuance to just sort of try to
discredit.
Win points and be like, well, you didn't. Well, what about this French Revolution? Because there were like 5 of them.
What about this niche thing that nobody has heard of?
Yeah, and it's like, or something that's big, and it's like, well, Marx said that the revolution would happen in England, and it never did, and it's one of the most conservative democracies in the world, and it's like, yeah, but like, no one is saying that it has to be exactly as written, or else it's not true. So it's important to note, as you are, that these conversations are always full of nuance and can go around and around, and should. But that doesn't mean because something doesn't get brought up. And that's sort of the argument of class reductionism, which we should explain really fast. The argument that's often made from people who want to discredit Marxists is that they will say that Marx and communism or Marxism or whatever is, quote, class reductionist, which is to say that everything is about class and nothing is about, say, race or gender or, other identity-based stuff. And so if you're a class reductionist, you don't care about slavery. You don't care about, systemic racism. You don't care about systemic sexism and the patriarchy or whatever. Get him. Oh. So that's the idea of class reductionism, which is just a ridiculous argument made in bad faith. I'm just gonna say that. Like, I have never met or read a class reductionist ever. It's sort of it's a
manufactured ideology.
It is a straw man argument. Which is a straw man argument is you make the perfect enemy and then you just claim that everything that you're talking about is that straw man, right? And class reductionism in our circle is the perfect straw man, because you can say, well, I don't read Marx because he was a white man from Europe and he's Eurocentric. And it's like, well, but
you hear that a lot.
But and as per the Marxist class that we took together, then you find out that actually he wrote about colonialism and the oppression of non-white people around the world constantly,
and slavery
in the United States
to extensive degree.
Yeah, because he's not a class reductionist. The idea of the class struggle is that is the vehicle of the social change. It's not the only part of the social change. Death number 1.
Well, there's number 1.
Death number 1. Where do I write this down? I'm gonna write it in the back.
Yeah, you did not die against him.
No, I didn't.
You punched him half to death, so that was embarrassing.
I punched him on the way down.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Chomsky. Death count. 1.
Yeah. screen is like absurdly dark in the room I'm recording in, which does not help.
Oh,
But that's just an excuse.
that's just an excuse not to beat the Silent Demon on the first try. Look, this is not a competition between you and me at Dark Souls.
It's not?
No.
Are you sure?
I'm positive. It's a competition between you and me as intellectuals, and I'm gonna win. So,
Oh, okay. Dark Souls is also in there, but it's like a side
yeah,
show.
nobody cares about that part. Okay, so yeah, the class reductionist thing is important though because it's part of the nuance conversation. We get accused of class reductionism so much. Not me and you. I mean, that has happened, but just people like us.
Socialist.
Yeah. And it's like, no, like there is so much to be said about the patriarchy and race in Marxism. Marx even talked about it. Marx,
God damn it.
Marx even talked about it, and so it's like don't come at me with that bullshit where you just don't. And I firmly believe this. Here's a hot take. I firmly believe that people that make that argument just don't want to read theory. Like I get the feeling that those people feel intimidated by reading theory, and because very few people that have actually read Marx who are academic make that accusation. If they do, they do it with tons of caveats, and it's in an academic way. But the sort of like touche argument that people feel with Marxism, it just seems to me that it's usually because they just don't want to read Marx. And if
that's definitely an element of it, yeah.
Yeah, and I've met people who say I've read Marx and I like some of it, but I don't like all of it, so I don't consider myself a Marxist, which is totally valid. And that's a
I think
a real
there's
thing.
Also that this might be getting off track, but I think that a lot of people I think that like you don't have to agree with everything Marx ever wrote to call yourself a Marxist.
Exactly. Yeah.
So I think that also is like a fine line where a lot of people who refuse to call themselves a Marxist agree with Marx on all the important bits, but have some minor like sideline disagreement with him, and therefore don't want to use the term.
Right.
Which it's their choice, but
right. So that is where we come at this discussion from in terms of the theory background. Now I'm going to talk about Dark Souls as you punch this asylum demon in the butt. Okay.
I'll probably die again.
Well, just do your best. We're here to have fun.
No, we're not. That's not true. We're not even supposed to be funny, remember?
Oh yeah, I forgot about that. We made a pledge. So, the story of Dark Souls, as per the opening cinematic. Well, first of all, Dark Souls, for the uninitiated, is sort of to pull a phrase from Red Dead Redemption, is sort of deliberately enigmatic. It on purpose, it's kind of vague and gives you very little information, and you kind of have to piece things together through context clues and item descriptions, just like real life. So, there's no person with a question mark over their head that you can go talk to that's going to like tell you all the things you need to know. You just sort of have to figure stuff out. But at the beginning of the game, there is an opening cutscene that is like 5 minutes long, and it explains the general story up to this point, the general sort of world. Good job, by the way. Nice work.
Yeah, second try.
Nice work.
Not bad.
Nice work. And it explains that there was an age of ancients. In that age of ancients, the world was gray. There was no light and no dark. It was just sort of monotone. And it was craggy and ashen or not even ashen, just sort of like stone, basically. Stagnant, exactly. And that time was ruled by the ancient dragons. The ancient dragons were ostensibly invincible. Their scales were made of stone that was impenetrable. They were all powerful, and everything bent to their whims. the most creatively named kingdom of all time?
Lord Rand.
It's the land of the ancient lords. What do we call it? I don't know. Fucking Thordran. Move on. I have so much more work to do. It doesn't matter what it's called.
I've been in my fucking basement writing about this obscure ass universe for the past 14 months. For God's sake, don't make me come up with a name.
It doesn't fucking matter. Call it Lord Rand. It doesn't matter. Move on.
Oh my God! Look how puffy.
I know. Yeah. Oh, that's Chomsky right there.
God.
Woo!
Oh.
That's your boy.
Yeah, man. I don't know if I can get through this whole playthrough like this.
I'm already feeling hot about it.
That fucking thong.
Oh yeah, yeah. See, remember, Thoughts and Prayers was naked for a long time, and then you were like, "Did you mean to do that?" I think Hot Chomsky should just be naked all the time because we're trying to
think so?
we're trying to do the fan service. No, yeah, do whatever you want.
That's fair.
He's a skeptic.
Enlightened skeptic, yeah.
Enlightened centrist over here.
Yeah. Controlled opposition.
He's the DSA.
Oh, whoa. Yeah.
Okay, so back to what I was saying, which is, so there's the Age of Ancients, giant dragons made of stone that controlled everything. But they weren't the only creatures that existed. There were also, let's just call them people, because they are later called gods, which is confusing because it makes it sound like they were, it's very Greco-Roman actually, where it's like the Titans were before the gods, and then the gods, and then man. Like that's kind of here. It's like the dragons, and then the gods, and then man. So these people, who would eventually become the gods, start conspiring against the dragons.
Mm-hmm.
Gwyn.
Mm-hmm. And
go ahead.
They pick up like these souls, which, you could say is what transforms them from. That's like where they derive their power from, right? The great soul.
Exactly.
You'll like that.
Yeah. No. Exactly. So these are sort of prominent leaders of these people, and one of them is Gwyn. One of them is the witches of Izalith. So that's like a coven of witches. One of them is Nito, and those were all people. And then one of them is Seath, who is a dragon, and we'll get to that.
Mm-hmm.
But basically, these groups conspire to take down the dragons and take over everything that's going on. They come from the land below. Above is the unchanging gray landscape of the dragons. Below are these cave structures that are fiery. They're filled with fire, which in the dialectical model creates both light and shadow. So down where there is activity, down where there is fire, where there is chaos, as the game often calls fire, there is activity. Up above, where there is stagnation, there is no activity, there's no change, which already is a link to the lord and bondsman idea that I was talking about earlier, where below, where there is fire, where there is toil, the oppressed gain a consciousness, whereas above it is stagnant and nothing changes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The first flame, as it's called, is the source of this fire down below. And the people that live down there, that would become the gods, learn how to harness it in various ways. Gwyn creates spears made of lightning to accost the dragons. The witches of Izalith create firestorms with it, and use it as like pyromancy. Nito somehow turns the fire into the concept of death I don't really know exactly how he does that, but
Yeah.
nothing.
Nito, I think, is the strangest and most confusing of the lords.
Yeah, he's cool though.
Because,
He's a,
yeah, he is cool.
he's a
He has the
skeleton
most,
boy.
I guess, abstract relationship.
Yes.
And I kind of have a fan theory
Oh.
on that, but that's for later.
All right. I definitely want to hear about that fan theory though. So
Mm-hmm.
so everything was essentially undying at this time because it was all stagnant, and so Nito uses the fire to create the concept of death, which you just did a death. Number two.
It's the same way
Yeah.
you fucking die.
Yep. Except that was my first one. This is your second one, but yeah.
I'm
Yep.
behind, and I'm fucking ugly again.
It it is an unwritten rule of Dark Souls that the deadliest thing in the game, 100%, is gravity.
Yeah.
100%. Nothing in these games is more deadly than gravity. And then Seath, who was a dragon, was called Seath the Scaleless because unlike his comrades, who were all made of stone, this dragon was just fleshy and disgusting and didn't have any stone on him. And so he resents the other dragons for being more powerful than him. He is what we would call, say it.
A class traitor.
He's a class traitor. He's a straight up class traitor, y'all. And
yeah.
And he teaches the gods, these people, the vulnerability of the dragons. So he betrays the other dragons and teaches them the vulnerability. With all of these things combined, the gods are able to defeat the dragons and end the Age of Ancients and usher in the Age of Fire, which is where we find ourselves in the game. So, in my view of it, the first flame ends up being consciousness. It ends up being a raised consciousness and awareness of the world amidst that guy just ate it. Amidst
following my footsteps.
Yes, well, gravity.
Yeah.
It's a raised consciousness amidst a world of stagnation, right?
Yeah. No, exactly, and that plays exactly into like the master-slave dialectic. The dragons were dominating, but were like stagnant and in a way almost unconscious, unchanging.
Yes.
Whereas fire brings about consciousness and change through its like more direct relation to reality.
Exactly. It is changing. It is chaotic. It is dynamic, let's say, as opposed to the static of the stone, which just is always the same. So that's the background. That's what we find out in the opening cinematic of the game. And, for most people that are playing, we're like, cool, there's dragons and gods and stuff. Great. When do I kill things?
Yeah.
But what I think is genius about it is that what that reminds me of is feudalism, which was static, and, depending on how you want to define it, around the world, most societies were feudal for a long time, with Native American societies being the sort of obvious exception. In feudalism, a landed aristocracy of nobles who claimed their power from their god, whichever gods they were. It might have been, the Abrahamic traditions, or it might have been Hindu, or or whatnot. Nobles were unchanging, static. There was wars between them and stuff, and borders changed, but the idea of the social structure was unchanging, and unquestioned.
A millennium.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, and unquestioned. No, it was not, and this is what makes Monty Python's Holy Grail. Have you seen that movie?
That's one of my favorite movies.
Great, excellent. That's what makes so many of those jokes so funny. Like when King Arthur rides up to the peasants that are just stacking mud, which is just great, and he says, "I am your king," and then the one says, he doesn't exactly say it like this. Yeah, he's like, "King? well, I didn't vote for you. You know, like that. The bit there is that the peasant wouldn't know to even think that that was an option because it's
Yeah.
unquestioned that the king is the king, right? So
Yeah.
that's the dragons to me. Is this age of feudalism in which things are unchanging, the people toil underneath, and then a consciousness is raised. But I think it's especially interesting that the Age of Fire comes next because instead of it being a proletarian revolution, a revolution of the workers, it's not. It's a revolution of the gods. It's a revolution
Yeah.
of what we would call now the bourgeoisie, the middle class, those
Mhm.
who were the leaders and in charge of the workers, of the sort of aimless masses, uh,
Mhm.
to supplant the dragons, to supplant the aristocracy.
Mhm. Mhm.
So when the Age of Fire comes around, right, it's not like then everyone is equal and you know it's a utopia. The gods just take over for the dragons in terms of being in charge.
Yeah. There's new rulers.
Right. Watch out here. Oh,
Oh.
oh, you good? You got plenty of assists. Got him.
Yeah. Getting ganged up on is probably the second most
Yes.
deadly thing in Dark Souls.
Yes. Well, oh, it's just 4 Krogs. They're super easy. They die in one hit. How hard could it be? You know?
You'd think so.
Yeah.
God.
Hubris. Hubris. There you go.
Yeah.
So the Age of Fire is next, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
In the Age of Fire, which is where we find ourselves now, unlike the unchanging Age of Ancients, the Age of Fire is dynamic and chaotic and full of fragmentation. Mankind
Yes.
is decaying, as we can physically see on your hot body right now. Uh,
Not so hot right now,
well, I
unfortunately.
mean, you know, depends on what your kink is,
Eye
but
of the beholder.
yes, exactly. Um, and what we find out, spoiler alert, is that this world that we're in, the sun that is casting light, you know, in over the kingdom right now, the sun that you're standing in, is a false sun. The sun and the light has actually gone out, and this sun and this light is an illusion, sort of like a star that you're seeing in the night sky that actually burned out, you know, billions of years ago. Uh,
Yeah.
it's an illusion of the light that was created during the Age of Fire. And so it's a decayed world that's pretending to still be relevant.
Oh, that's so much better.
The light that you just added is artificial light, Taylor. That is a remnant.
Yeah, yeah. You're talking about artificial light
Yeah,
inspired me.
yeah, yeah. So
It's easier to see in the recording.
yeah, I mean, it was easy to see either way, but if you can play
Uh,
better, that's all that matters.
yeah, I think the lighting in here was just god awful.
I my
In the room I'm in.
the donkey playthrough of Dark Souls is hilarious. I don't know if you've seen that video, but or
Yeah.
or if you know Donkey, but but probably there's a lot of really great jokes from that, but one of the best ones is
Yeah.
he turns the brightness all the way down to 0 and he says this is the way the game was intended to be played.
That is one of the best videos of all time.
Yeah,
I'm not gonna lie.
yeah, it's good. Um, so false light, fragmentation, an age of decay in the Age of Fire.
Uh-huh.
Right. So I'm trying to draw
Yeah.
this comparison between the end of feudalism and the beginning of bourgeois capitalist society, because that was our
Mhm.
real life history, where the merchant class, the bourgeois class, the middle class, supplanted the aristocracy across Europe and across the world, also because of colonialism, and installed capitalism essentially, and I'm probably going to get some flack for this, but essentially everywhere in the world. I'd argue that there's
Yeah,
nowhere in the
more or
world
less.
that isn't capitalist.
Yeah, and people will, not brief tangent, people will like try and deflect from that saying that there's still non-industrialized societies, but the important note there is that those societies aren't industrial or capitalist in like our normal understanding because of the design of capitalist nations. Like
Right.
India, for example, was kept agrarian by UK colonial policy.
Right.
And that's why it's not as developed in,
Yeah.
that's what the IMF would, the International Monetary Fund, and like economic students would say it's not as developed or whatever.
Right.
Um,
That argument.
but that's a deliberate design of capitalist powers and capitalist systems. It's not a non-capitalist society.
Exactly. Yeah. That argument is essentially like saying Appalachia is not a capitalist part of the United States because it's not as
Yeah.
developed. It's like, fuck off. Like, that's so stupid. That's such a stupid thing to say. You know what I mean? It's like, no, it's part of a capitalist system. Not every part, and this is another thing people get wrong about capitalism, is that not every part of capitalism is McDonald's and Hyatt hotels.
Yeah.
Like,
It's not uniform.
yeah, like
that.
in fact, it has to not be uniform. It has to be an age of decay and fragmentation in order to work, right? Because there has to be areas that are exploited more than others.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
Anyway, so yeah, good caveat there. So, Seath, the class trader, as there were in the time of the end of feudalism, there were those nobles who sided with the bourgeois.
Someday we should do a whole episode on the French Revolution because I just wrote
sure.
like a big ass paper on that and Marxism, and
yeah, absolutely.
I really enjoyed writing that paper.
I love the French Revolution.
Yeah.
But Seath basically betrays his own, helps them usher in this new world, and for his betrayal, he is gifted by the gods a workspace, a workshop of which you go to in the game, where he does experiments and basically gets to live in sort of luxury for the rest of time. And so, very similar to, you thought there was a secret thing hidden in that, didn't you?
Yeah, a little bit.
Very similar to the aristocracy of, say, England in after the Magna Carta, where
that's an excellent example, actually.
Yeah, where it's like okay, well, I mean, actually, it's not that great of an example because the Magna Carta really actually gave power to the aristocracy that was still the noble class. But whatever, you get what I'm saying. Where like they still have a monarchy, or Sweden is another example, but they still have a monarchy that has that gets to keep all of its riches and taxpayers pay for it, which is like, what the fuck, like why are people okay with that? But whatever. But they just sort of get to do their own thing, and they don't really make a whole lot of decisions. So that's kind of like what's going on with Steve.